Director for Amnesty International here in the region. And then we have Cousin Zilala on my right, who is the Executive Director of Amnesty International here in Zimbabwe. So our global state of human rights covers 159 countries across the world. In Southern Africa, we are covering 11 countries, which Zimbabwe is one of them. So Debros is going to start with giving us the global overview, global and regional overview. And then Cousin Zilala will come in and give us the country overview for Zimbabwe. And then we're going to follow up that with questions from you guys, and then we take it from there. So over to you, Debros.
Thank you, Robert. My name is Debros Mchena. I'm the Regional Director for Amnesty International Southern Africa. Our regional office for Southern Africa is based in Johannesburg, and on my right is Mr. Cousin Zilala, who is our Executive Director, Amnesty International Zimbabwe. I wish I would say good afternoon, but given the state of the global human rights situation, there is absolutely nothing good about the afternoon. So I'll go straight into our message to the world. First, our Global State of Human Rights report is a product of Amnesty International's documentation of human rights situation in our countries. And it is fact-based, as we only report facts that we have captured in a given year. And then it also analyzes in a comprehensive way what this means for human rights in the present and the future. Our report is a report that is 408 pages, covering 159 countries and territories. And therefore, it's pretty comprehensive, and I would really invite you to get into the actual cases of each of the countries that you might want to report on. The top line message that we are giving is a continuation of the message we gave last year, that the spread of hate and fear politics has spared governments who have shown a callous disregard for fundamental freedoms in our world, fueling a resurgence in protest movements. Rather than giving in to the narrative of fear, ordinary people across the world are in fact clamoring for justice, helping to breathe new life into old struggles and igniting new era of social activism. In fact, if you look at what has happened under the Trump administration, if you look at what's happening in Philippines under Duterte, if you look at what's happening in India, if you look at what's happening with Herman Mashaba in Johannesburg, and a number of other global leaders who have promoted the politics of demonization, we can see that in 2017, based on the cases we recorded, hate and fear crossed over from just being a political rhetoric to a reality, as far too many governments sought to implement policies that would normalize massive discrimination against minorities and marginalized groups. I've already indicated that, for example, we saw the targeting of several Muslim majority countries entering the United States for a travel ban under a controversial travel ban order. In Hungary, we saw new laws that placed refugees in containers as new blatantly discriminatory regulations were unrolled. We also saw this idea of targeting Muslims in other countries, including the so-called abnormal beards in a predominantly Muslim province in China. In Egypt, authorities discriminated against Christians. And in many other countries, such as in Myanmar, we witnessed probably the most terrifying consequence, which is encouraged by hate as a result of now the largest refugee crisis in 2017, 655,000 moving out of Myanmar as a result of the politics of fear into neighboring Bangladesh and other territories in the region. With few leaders willing to stand up for human rights on the world stage, governments are shamelessly rolling back hard-won human rights protections. We've seen examples of the undermining of judicial independence in places like Poland. We've seen Russia decriminalizing some aspects of domestic violence, but not all. We've seen Palestine introducing new laws permitting arbitrary detention of those who criticize the authorities online. We saw in India the Supreme Court introducing a weakening of the law that protected women from domestic violence and abuse, and the US have already been mentioned. In France and in Europe, we also see a target of refugees and others that are considered not European enough. This has created a politics of fear and hatred across the world, which Amnesty International today is highlighting to the world. But we're also highlighting a response. People are mobilizing because governments are failing to meet their basic needs, especially when it comes to housing, employment, economic rights. There is a particular focus in 2017 where across the world we documented the impact of austerity on human rights. And across the region here, as I will go further, I will be demonstrating how governments are leaving the deficit unaddressed in the area of economic, social, cultural rights, creating a toxic mix of responses by those that are speaking truth to power being targeted for arrest and other forms of intimidation. The basic job of governments, in our view, is to protect citizens and to promote their rights and to build inclusive societies. And across the region, our report is demonstrating that many of our countries are failing to live up to this requirement. It is clear that in 2018, as we enter 2018, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights will turn 70 in December this year. We can no longer take for granted the status of human rights across the world. And in fact, it is our view that freedom of speech will take center stage in the battleground for human rights, and we must urgently protect it across countries. From attacks of the press to prominent leaders touting fake news as a way of manipulating public opinion, to closure of NGOs, killing of activists, speaking truth to power is becoming more dangerous. But in a climate where governments are using mass communication to stoke fear and control speech, it is more vital that human rights defenders, including Amnesty International, speak out. Last year was a proof that no matter how disenfranchised people are, we always have to call for freedom, equality, and dignity. This is an organizing principle of human survival. Instead of trying to silence people when they speak out, we are actually asking governments to dig deeper into investigating the genuine root cause of the concerns that people have. And it is in this root cause investigation that our report documents violations that have taken place in Southern Africa. And I just want to turn to the regional picture of Southern Africa in summary. Across our region, there is the combination of a triple burden of poverty, of unemployment, and inequality, creating such a massive denial of rights for people from Zimbabwe to Angola. And this is a message we are giving to governments that in 2017, governments failed to translate what is in constitutional obligations in terms of economic, social, and cultural rights into a reality. We're also saying that across the region, there was a decisive attack of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of movement, as country cases will show, including when Kazan speaks on Zimbabwe. In Madagascar, for example, environmental activist Clovis Bazafimalala, who has been campaigning for the ending of illegal trafficking in rosewood, which is a precious resource for Madagascar, was put on pre-trial detention for a period of over 10 months for absolutely committing no offense, and Amnesty International will campaign for his release. In Malawi, we continue to see the threats of people who live, or people with albinism, who continue to be a target of unlawful killings as a result of societal practice and belief that if you kill, abduct, or use the bones of a person with albinism, you are likely to get rich. We're working in the country with the government to ensure that the 20 cases of murder committed since 2014 are concluded. And in fact, as we began the year in 2017, 2 murders were committed just in the space of 2 months. First, in February, in Longwe, of a woman called Messi Zainab, who was found with missing body parts after being murdered in a gruesome killing that is still to be investigated. We also have a case of a young 10-year-old who was killed in Mozambique after visiting relatives because of albinism. And this is something that really needs to be dealt with. And across the region, we're starting to see in Mozambique similar attacks of people with albinism taking place. In Zambia, just next door here, the Public Order Act, which is a colonial era piece of legislation enacted in the 1950s, were constantly used by the government to harass and limit the freedoms of journalists, of political leaders, and of civil society leaders. We saw Hakainde Hichilema, an opposition leader, tortured, harassed, and detained after trumped-up charges of treason were preferred against him. being released later on following an international campaign. Civil society activists such as Laura Miti and people like Pilato the musician have been targeted for speaking out against corruption when they went to parliament to demand an explanation on the purchasing by the Zambian government of 42 trucks for 42 million, which were supposed to be firefighting trucks. So things like this in countries of the region are starting to create an impression that governments are rolling back freedoms that had been protected before. We also saw a particular attack across the region of women's rights. Violence against women was on the increase in South Africa. We documented cases of violence against women, including killings. In Malawi and in Mozambique, we recorded cases of femicide and domestic disagreements resulting in death for women, and limited mechanism of effectively investigating these cases so that they can be concluded. So women continue to be on the receiving end of violations at the domestic level, but also in attack, especially of their sexual and reproductive rights, as we saw in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, and in Namibia. Particularly Namibia, we covered the case of a huge backlog in delivery of housing. 500,000 people are still living in squatters in a country which is supposedly a middle-income economy. In Botswana, the encampment policy for refugees is creating massive human rights deprivations for refugees in Botswana because they are unable to move to get jobs and be properly integrated in the country. And we just saw, just 2 weeks, a few days ago, an execution through killing because Botswana retains the death penalty, one of the countries in the region that executed. These violations in Botswana undermine the standing of Botswana as a country that is supposedly respecting human rights. We also saw 3 journalists from the Inc. Center for Investigative Journalism intimidated by security forces for taking pictures in a village where the house of the current president is allegedly being built. These intimidatory tactics have a smear and fear tactic that they instill in those who are passing information in the field of media. In Mozambique, we're dealing with cases that we record in our annual report of a government that is failing to protect civilians in areas where extractive industries are taking place. In the case of Nampula, which is a rich province, rich in natural resources, a Chinese company called Hayu is extracting heavy sand at the expense of villagers who have now been displaced and are unable to produce and provide for themselves in terms of their right to food. We've also seen similar experiences of large-scale land acquisition having an impact on human rights and the right to food in the Benguela province of Angola, in the Wila province to the south of Luanda, and in Zambia, where large-scale land acquisition is taking place without protecting the peasants who are working on the land. This creates a rising call for business and human rights to be a central part of the governance agenda. SADC has 16 countries, but we covered 11 because the other 3, Tanzania, DRC, and the island territories are not part of what we cover. They are covered under our regional office in Nairobi. But if you look at the report, you will be able to see what we are calling for. I want to conclude by making calls before I give to Cousin to give us a detailed account of Zimbabwe. What this means when we look at an overall call that we are making first across the globe and then second across the region is that as we approach the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in December 2018, the challenge ahead of us is very clear. This moment is a moment to reclaim the essential idea of equality and of dignity for all people, to cherish these values and demand that they become a foundation for policy making and in particular in practice. This is a call where for governments that are talking about just building economic development without human rights, they are missing the point, because economic development without rights leads to social exclusion. Our message is that we have to combine human rights and economic development strategy together. A pronounced absence of one materially affects the other. So we are making 3 calls. 1, government should make human rights a priority both at home and abroad, with prominent leaders trying to undermine fundamental rights and crimes against humanity being committed, war crimes being ignored, the lack of human rights leadership at the global stage is in fact worrying and is approaching dangerous consequences. Traditional leaders that usually take leadership at a global level are moving back. It is time probably for new leaders in the global south and east to emerge and occupy that vacuum. Speaking out has become more dangerous, and governments must reverse this trend so that we are able to protect the widely cherished free speech. Any society that is innovating and developing prioritizes free speech. We have an experience here in this country of a company called Econet. It would not have been there if the freedom of free speech and expression had not been protected by the courts. Across the world, we see the relationship between innovation, freedom of expression, and economic development. So speaking out needs to be protected. A society can only flourish if it is encouraging scrutiny of those in power rather than discouraging it and intimidating them. Instead of creating hate pandering that we are seeing across the globe, governments must unite everyone around real issues like health, education, housing, stable employment, and sanitation. The failure to give people their basic economic, social, cultural rights are the real reason why we are having social movements rising up, campaigning to make those things addressed. Even in the richest countries, even in middle-income countries, even in our country, Zimbabwe, we're experiencing significant decline in deficit in ESCR rights, and we're making a call for this to be redressed. So with that, I want to invite Cousin, who has a specific message for Zimbabwe, since he's the director of Amnesty International Zimbabwe. Thank you.
I will highlight human rights violations that have taken place in Zimbabwe, or human rights issues that took place in Zimbabwe in 2017. In this report, the state of the world's human rights, viral and driven by ordinary people, in particular young people, who bear the triple burden of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Although the campaigns were originally peaceful, but eventually the violent elements, frequently in reaction to heavy-handedness by the authorities and the shrinking lack of space for people to organize and express their views. The trend of opinions and the reclaiming their rights through acts of solidarity, boycotts, extensive creative use of social media. I'll touch on freedom for association and assembly. The state continued to use laws to crack down on dissenting voices. The police dispersed meetings or peaceful protests using excessive force. On 26 June, police arrested Pastor Ivan Mawarire in Harare after he held prayers at the University of Zimbabwe with the medical students who were protesting against increase in fees. He was held at Harare Central Police Station for 2 days before being released on bail on charges of inciting public violence and disorderly conduct. He was acquitted on 29 September, although separate charges remained against him relating to different arrests until he was finally acquitted in November. Freedom of expression. The state restricted the right to freedom of expression, particularly on human rights defenders and other human rights activists. In August, we saw the arrest of Energy Mutodi, a businessman, and supporter of Emerson Mnangagwa, who was arrested in Harare by the Criminal Investigation Department for suggesting on a Facebook page that a coup was likely if President Mugabe did not appoint his successor carefully. He was charged of undermining the president's authority and causing disaffection among the police and the defense forces. On 23 August, he was released from Harare Remand Prison on bail, but his case was ongoing at the end of the year. Victor Matemadanda, an executive member of the National Liberation War Veterans Association, was detained by police at Harare Central Police in August on charges of undermining the office of the president and causing disaffection among the police and the defense forces. He had called the president, the former President Mugabe, to step down, and he was released on bail after several days, but his case remained pending until the end of the year. On November 3, journalist Martha O'Donovan, a US national, was arrested at home by police and charged with insulting the president and attempting to subvert a constitutionally elected government. She was alleged to have insulted President Mugabe on Twitter. We also saw arbitrary arrests and detentions, especially by the military police, who arrested a number of suspects on charges of fraud and corruption during the political transition last year. The arrested included senior state officials implicated in corruption, whose rights were denied on arrest, including access to the lawyers. Amnesty International is calling for the respect for justice in pursuit of anyone who is suspected of any criminal activity. We also saw forced evictions taking place in April, where police used the excessive force to evict about 15 families from Manzou Farm in Mashonaland Central. And the evictions actually contravened the High Court order on 24 March, which directed the government to end the practice of arbitrary evictions and home demolitions without providing compensation and alternative land for those who have been evicted. The residents who had lived at Manzou Farm had been there since 2000, and about 200 families were left homeless and without compensation. The authorities and the police in particular must conduct themselves in a manner consistent with the letter and spirit of the Constitution when carrying out evictions in the future. On the economic, social, and cultural rights space, the economic instability, drought, high poverty levels, and unemployment put obstacles in the way of access to education, health, and adequate food. In July, Zimbabwe reported to the Voluntary National Review of Sustainable Development Goals for the UN high-level political platform that over 76% of children extreme poverty. Difficulties in paying basic school fees were widespread. The National Food and Nutrition Council found out that 63% of school-age children were turned away from school for non-payment of fees. And an estimated 4.1 million of people who are living in the rural areas are reported to be food insecure. The right to health is increasingly threatened as allocation of the budget to health has decreased to only 8.2% of the national budget. Amnesty International remains worried that the poorest of the poor are suffering because of Zimbabwe's poor economy. I'll just go along with the call that Depros has made, though he has been making this call at the global level, but I'll make this call at local level. There's no reason why our government should not be a human rights respecting government, because the demand by the civilians is increasing. So the government has no option but to be a government respecting human rights. In terms of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, that should be guaranteed to the media as well as to human rights defenders and human rights activists. Harassment and attack on media and activists must stop. And unifying every citizen should be a priority of a government to make sure that we are focusing on discussing issues of health, housing and stable employment. There should be a provision of basic rights to bring hope to the country of Zimbabwe. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Give us your name and the organization that you work for.
My name is Lucy Yassine. I'm a freelance journalist.
Okay.
Mr. Zana just made reference of harassment of journalists and human rights defenders. There's a fresh experience only yesterday when journalists were covering the burial of the late Morgan Tramila in Bulgaria. There was a high level of harassment of journalists and very inflammatory statements were made. So I would like to hear your comment, considering we are approaching elections. What would be a comment on that?
My question is also directed to Mr. Silano. You referred to the poor funding in the health sector. I would want to hear from you as an organization that deals with human rights, whether the 5% airtime levy that is contributing to the health fund has made any great impact in terms of your funding in Zimbabwe.
My name is Costa, yes, from 263 Jet. Okay. I just wanted to hear again from Mr. Slata. As we approach elections, we know the trends in Zimbabwe, especially in rural areas. And recently there have been reports where rural occupants have been compelled to bring or to submit registration slips. That's a violation of human rights itself. And therefore I wanted to hear where Amnesty International, the position where it is right now in terms of trying to mitigate or to elaborate totally, sort of try to encourage the people so that they can participate in political activities without expecting anything or any hate from the government or from any political aligned groups.
I wanted to find out exactly how protected were women's rights in Zimbabwe over the course of the transition.
Okay. We'll share our responses, so it may not really matter which person we start with. But we couldn't be in a position really to say which political party is more violent than the other. What we actually strongly condemn is violence in any way, violence of any form, whether it is government or private citizens or it is state-sponsored. We condemn violence in all terms possible, strong terms possible. Then the funding of health, actually that is our worry as well as Amnesty International, because we don't see the impact of the fund that you referred to, because what we see is the reduction instead of the increase in the budget that is allocated to health. And for as long as the government does not prioritize health as a human rights issue, does not prioritize health as an issue that is supposed to be basic to its citizens. The provision of health has to be a basic provision to its citizens. Then we get worried with such an approach by government. So we have not seen the impact in terms of positive impact in as far as whether any fund that has been created by government, it has not contributed to that positive impact in terms of health delivery. I think the issue of the BVR registration, we are equally concerned, because for us we consider that as a threat to freedom of expression, because the purpose of registration for being a voter is to express yourself, to express a leader of your choice, and also who you want to associate with. And once that is threatened, we raise alarm. And we have actually taken cases in England of people who have had their registrations, their BVR registration numbers taken. They've compiled, we have assisted them to compile a petition that we have taken to ZEC, and we have actually given to lawyers to take the matter with the courts. That is we condemn such kind of a behavior because it infringes on the rights that I've mentioned. That person may want to respond to the question.
Okay. Well, the first one relates to comparison of which parties are more violent. There's a general approach. We don't compare countries as a principle when we're documenting human rights violations. It's not a ranking order. It's not a beauty contest. One human rights violation committed on one person carries with it the same burden of responsibility on duty bearers as 10 people whose rights have been violated. And therefore the call is generally to all duty bearers to ensure that they are taking decisive steps to protect, fulfill, and to promote. And therefore we would not be able to rank political parties or governments or institutions, but we would make a general call. And the evidence we have in our report specifically speaks to the cases that Cousin was talking about, and many other cases across Southern Africa. And I wanted to answer the question of whether women's rights were protected during the transition. In our report, we cover the rest of 2017 and the status of women's rights in Zimbabwe, as well as women's rights across the region. And we particularly enter the issue of barriers that are standing in the way for accessing sexual health and reproductive rights for women, and in particular adolescent girls, because a fifth of maternal mortality rates is taking place among 15 to 19-year-olds in Zimbabwe because of ignorance, laws that are conflicting, taboos and stigma associated with early pregnancy and so on. And that is the focus we took. And the investment in health, including what is effective for budgetary allocation, is what Cousin has been talking about. The 8% allocation from the total budget, if you unpack it to see how much of the 8% was going into PSIP, or Public Sector Investment Program, for curative medicine, for research, versus what was going to salaries, you would see that the health budget then gets consumed in recurrent expenditure. So there is need to move the health investment and financing for health using even domestic resource mobilization and other forms of funding to secure women's rights. Specifically during the transition, we haven't documented the cases. It will be coming up in our first quarter report of what has actually happened since this transition began to take place, because there have been reports that we're still trying to verify. But whenever a violation is taking place in political upheavals, it takes a characteristic impact on women that is much higher pronounced than others. There is a tendency to target women in order to eating the sex of the donkey. So you target women in order to get to the person you are targeting. Pre-trial detention in Madagascar that I talked about is targeted on women for husbands who are running amok, or for children who are running amok. And we need a real commitment to rights respect in society. As we approach elections, the question on elections, it's important that all political parties commit to a human rights manifesto that we will be releasing. It's important that parties contesting in elections are committing to one thing, which is enabling all people in the country to exercise their right, but also to ensure that the long decades of struggles and aspirations that led Zimbabweans to struggle against one-man rule or strong-man politics is not reproduced at a time when we're expecting Zimbabwe to open a new chapter after the events of November. That's what I would say to your question.
Thank you for that. I think what we condemn any harassment of journalists who are exercising their professional duty. It's not a crime to exercise your professional duty as a journalist. And for anyone to feel offended or not to demonstrate the level of intolerance to such an extent, it's strongly condemned. And we would not really, there's no way we would actually not condemn such kind of an act. Whether it's done by the opposition or an individual or a company or a government, it will be condemned in its strongest terms.
I think in Cousin's redress, or rather Cousin's address, not redress, he spoke about the importance of placing human rights on the highest pedestals during moments of political contestation. And what we're trying to do is to report to you documented evidence of 2017 as we get into 2018. So I don't want to get into a speculative enterprise by speaking to issues that we have not documented and analyzed, because we speak on facts that we have analyzed, documented, and verified. So the call we are making to governments based on the pattern of 2018 is that violence has been used as a strategy. Hate speech has been used as a strategy. Politics of demonizing, politics of scapegoating, fear-mongering, blaming the other, marginalizing small and minority groups, has been used across Southern Africa and across the continent. In 28 African countries, there were cases of violence against journalists. In almost 10 of our Southern African countries, there is either a cyber-security law being considered by parliament or being proposed by government or already passed. These things limit freedom of expression. And when freedom of expression is limited, exercising that right is then met with violence. So we're trying to address structural root causes of human rights violations as we saw them in 2017, and saying as we enter into 2018, as we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that governments and duty bearers have an obligation to open a fresh chapter and commit to a violent-free society, to a rights-respecting society, and to ensuring that courts are able to function to protect, promote, and defend those rights when they are violated. I think that's what we are saying as an organization, and we're not speculating about the things that we have not properly documented and analyzed.
I'm a freelance journalist.
So from?
I'm a freelance journalist.
Okay.
We welcome your report. My question is to any of you. What are governments' excuses, Southern African government's excuses, to their rolling back of decades of human rights progresses? What are the excuses which have been given by the government, especially in Southern Africa?
It's something that you have investigated and documented, but also it doesn't remove the relevance of something that you could have missed, that we are raising, of course, as a member of the Fourth Estate as well. So I'll go back again. I'm very much interested in human rights violations in rural areas, because that's where a lot of issues happen, and that's where a lot of information breakups and gaps are actually prominent. And I just wanted to ask, how swift is Amnesty International in terms of attending human rights violations in rural areas, and also what kind of communication do you have to get notice of those issues that would have happened? Do you have agents that brings you information at your fingertips? What kind of, what forms of communication that makes you act swiftly in terms of attending to those issues? John Cassin.
On the social-cultural rights, it's John Cassin, freelance journalist. On the social-cultural rights, on the patriarchal approach towards women's rights after their spouses die, we've seen it in Zimbabwe several times. The two examples is Priscilla Misai Rambo and the recent one, Elizabeth Changrai. Have you done any researches around those areas, and what do you have to say about it?
I will go back to the issue around the threat to lives. in the region, and the reference you made was the Malawi case where those with albinism were threatened. Have you made any research to find out the driving factor? Because there's also an element of religious groupings who tell people that if they do ABC, then they are going to be at this stage in terms of prosperity in their life. Has there been any investigation around that, especially focusing on the religious grouping, and more so these new churches that are coming up currently?
That's a very good question, and I think in my address that we are seeing globally, people who stand for human rights are usually seen as agents or as saboteurs or as people who are not patriotic or as people who are doing it on behalf of someone else and not necessarily standing up for the rights of their community themselves and their group. In our report that we documented from Madagascar, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, across the continent, we are documenting cases where human rights violations are being committed largely by governments, largely by companies, and others by individuals, especially when we documented cases of killings of women. And it's really the point we are making, that a culture of demonizing in order not to be held accountable is a driving force rather than actually an excuse. A driving force is the fear to account or the refusal to account for the manner in which public policy is executed. And I think country by country, we are indicating that sometimes it's actually an absence of a human rights-centered leadership. So when violations are taking place, they don't see it as part of their DNA, rather see it as until there's a big report before government and there's a truth to power being told. That's when we start to see a waking up. So the report and what it covers is a wake-up call for all governments to drop excuses and to not step up excuses, but actually step up responses to promote, fulfill, and protect. I think that's how far I can go in terms of responding to your particular question on what excuses. The second one is the Malawi case that you are talking about in terms of albinism. And I think we have Mongai in the room, who is our campaigner for a specialist person on Malawi, and she can probably add. But one of the things that we did was to produce an authoritative investigation into why we have violations of rights of persons with albinism in Malawi. And there are a number of myths that drive this, and belief systems, cultural belief systems, myths and inaccuracies, ignorance and poverty. They combine to create a susceptible group that is approached and approachable by people who believe that if you kill and sell bonds, you are likely to get rich. There are cases of graves being dug at night, or a huge trance of people that come to funerals of a person who will have died with albinism. And then there are definitely cases just of abductions and killings. These are driven by a combination of cultural beliefs, combination of poverty, because usually poor people are the ones that are approached, and even family members are involved, but also an absence of protection mechanisms by the police and a culture of impunity going on, because those who commit crimes then don't get prosecuted and the case is concluded. I indicated that there are 20 murder cases that we are tracking committed since 2014 that have not been concluded. And it's important that a functioning justice system that delivers fair trial and justice for victims will serve as a deterrent effect on further crimes being committed. We're currently working with the Malawian government. We have now made major reforms at a legal level, including the penal code, but also the Anatomy Act, to outlaw any sale of body tissue by anybody, and greater activism by the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on these things to end them. And this is now something that has been taken by the independent expert on the rights of persons with albinism as a continental initiative to stop the attacks and abuses and killings. So I think that is the context in which I can respond to that. The question of economic, social, cultural rights, and why I think your question was probably the link between patriarchy and denial of basic economic, social, cultural rights. for women. I think it's a contemporary question. Economic, social, cultural rights, or economic and social rights are being denied for various reasons that stand in the way of those enjoyment. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do in this press conference is to speak to the cases that we have documented, which are Zimbabwean and contemporary, and stop speculating on things that we don't have enough information, so that we don't run the risk of not giving you a fair chance. But I think across the region, there is a cultural problem of the status of women whose rights are undermined because of culture, where male dominance and male preference is protected, promoted, and even enjoyed, and it results in widows being discriminated against, being demonized, being stigmatized. I have also spoken about the impact of this stigma on young women, adolescent girls. I've also spoken about femicide, killings of women on the basis of crimes that are committed by their husbands. All these things combine to unleash a major vortex of violations of rights against women. And it's important that the states step up to ensure that we have enough protection mechanisms for widows, for women in general, and for young girls. And in the context of this call, the two cases you cite are just a living example of what happens if we do not have leadership on this question, which continues to be a regional scourge. I think that's where I'll leave it.
Yeah, I think the other question on how swift we are in responding to human rights violations or human rights abuses. I'm not sure whether I would say we are fast or not, but normally we base our advocacy or our campaigns on facts. We make sure that we have facts, we have evidence before we carry out a campaign. As a result, we have researchers who are supposed to go on the ground, researchers and campaigners who are supposed to go on the ground and get facts and evidence. However, we are structured in a way, especially at national level, in a way that Amnesty belongs to the membership. And it is the membership who take injustice personally at a local level. Our membership are activists in their own right. So their presence wherever they are located is they are the first agents of change who would take any human rights or any injustice personally. But at that level, if they find it difficult to address the matter, we would then take it up at a provincial level. We have provincial coordinators in all the provinces. And among you, I can see one of our former coordinators who is in here, who was taking that responsibility. And then at a national office, we also have a campaigner who is responsible for taking action whenever there is a human rights violation or a human rights abuse. So I wouldn't know whether we are very swift or we are very slow, but we want to base on facts where we have evidence and factual information.
I think I would just add that, just across the globe, the way we document the report is that we are launching this report simultaneously in 10 different global centers. And each of these global centers, which are regional offices and sections, like Zimbabwe, which is 26,000 members, the idea is researchers working, covering countries, and specialists document, and then process, verified, checking international law obligations of the country, and then releasing a report. When a violation is committed and it is reported or we are aware of it, we definitely use make calls. When the transition began, or what we call transition began, in November, we made a call for the military to do three things. First, to not clamp down on social media. Second, to not use the opportunity to punish political opponents. And third, to ensure that we continue to see the protection of rights as a basis of the transition. And I think there's been reports in media here in Zimbabwe and allegations of arrests, of targeted persecution, and there are actually known cases where we've seen one former minister who was brought to court and another political youth leader was brought to court. We have not seen many of the other cases that are reported as allegations, because we have not seen an investigation into the last 3 months period. But I think there's a lot of time to begin to go back and document experiences of what has happened, if family members come out, if investigators are able to come up with something. But as a general rule, we are very interested in ensuring that we flush out violations and surface them, either in the context of a report launch like this, but on a day-to-day basis as part of our engagement with government. And we look forward to engaging this new government in terms of our particular cause more directly, in terms of meeting with them. So I think you might probably be seeing us meeting with the government and its new leadership to make sure that we put cases before them more directly.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity and for the report. I want you to clarify on the response rate like he asked. Because if we, up to this stage, you don't have a report on what transpired during the operation Restore Lagos, it does say a lot about your response towards human rights violations. I want you to speak particular to that issue. My name is Admaya Masuku, I'm a media trainer. The other issue, you made reference to the cybersecurity laws that are being produced by different countries in Africa. We want to get more information on that, on those laws, and which countries are in the process of having such kind of laws, and what is Amnesty International's view towards the law that is being, the bill that is being, that is in Parliament currently on that issue. Then I have got a question on why you are not indexing countries. I have an interest to know why you are not indexing countries. For instance, why is it that we don't have an index on freedom of expression in African countries? Because you said you can't quantify, you can't value one human right again more than the other. But we are interested in knowing which country has got more violations when it comes to freedom of expression, when it comes to politics, when it comes to strongman politics and so forth. Why is it that as an organization you are not interested in that part? If you are for truth and you are for giving us the facts, after all you have given us the statistics, why can't we not have the index at the end of the day? Because in other reports such as Freedom House reports and so forth, we get these indexes, which country is doing poor in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of this and that. Why is it Amnesty International is not doing that in particular?
Looking at engaging with the new administration, but how hopeful is Amnesty International for greater protection of human rights in Zimbabwe?
Yes, the first question about what does it say about Amnesty International?
Oh, okay. First, let me deal with the ranking. Yeah. You know, look, human rights violations. It's not a contest between, you know, we only made at 1%, so you don't touch us. Touch those who made at 10. We are saying across the region, if you violate one right, we should be able to speak about it as you violate, because it starts with one person and then it moves, because a culture of impunity is what we're trying to stop. So we believe in speaking about violations in the manner in which we are doing. Document, respond, and engage governments, engage the media, engage civil society partners, so that together we can actually have a campaign to stop it. Because Amnesty is a people's movement. It's not like an NGO. It's a people's movement made up of activists, supporters, and so on, who work together, as my colleague said, to take injustice personally. So there are so many organizations that do ranking. I think that there is enough information from Freedom House and those who say Namibia is the most free in terms of press in Africa. We are not able to determine that. It's an exercise we leave for others who are doing ranking. So Transparency International ranks on corruption, MISA and others do those rankings. I don't think that we think we have a contribution to make. When we think we do not have a contribution to make in an area we believe others are taking decisive leadership, we leave that area and then others can use that information for the purposes for which they are generating it. We believe ours is to document cases when journalists are under attack, not just to campaign for the end of the attack, but to actually assist them through the legal process, as we did with Lloyd Mtungamiri, who was attacked and shot at in Lesotho, or with Keiso, who is now living in South Africa, or with Fred Membe and the newspaper Post, which was shut down, or the many other journalists that I reported about, Inc. Center for Investigative Journalism, Zodiac in Malawi, and there are 32 cases which we released in June last year, in September last, in June, when did you do the global, the Global Media Day?
It was on the 3rd of May.
Yeah, so we released 32 cases of journalists in Zimbabwe that MISA has documented. So we referenced material that has been documented by partners and colleagues, and there's no need to do anything more than highlight that. In terms of response rate, there is a significant ability to respond to human rights violations across many areas. What you are specifically asking for is whether we have documented the violations that you are making about the last 3 months in Zimbabwe. We have not documented that. We have not produced evidence of the violations. We have looked at cases that have been reported publicly. The cases that you know, we can talk about the cases that you know so that we can go public on them. The cases that have been gone through the courts, we've been doing monitoring of the courts, calling for fair trial to ensure that anybody who is taken through the criminal justice system, the criminal justice system cannot be used as a zone of political persecution through prosecution. And we've raised that significantly for social movement campaigners, including Ivan Mawari, that Cousin spoke about. So I think there is you can of course say what you think about our response, and we're willing to learn from what people think. But we really respond to human rights violations as speedily as we can, and it's something that we need to improve upon. The particular political development in Zimbabwe is something we have spoken about. What we have said is that the departure of President Robert Mugabe, who ran a brutal regime of repressing human rights, opens a fresh chapter for Zimbabwe and the new government to have a rights-based governance system in which they investigate the past, the present, and secure the future. That's the call we made at the time of the military-assisted transition. That's the call we made in statements we made around the departure of the president himself, and that's the call we are likely to make if and when we meet with the new government. And I believe that the human rights movement in Zimbabwe has taken a position on that and is acting on that, and would like to support what others are doing in the country in addition to what we think we can bring to make a meaningful difference. Sometimes speed of response is good. Sometimes resolution of a problem that affects real people is also important. So we would really like, if anybody has a case that they know of, to share with us so that we can follow it up and see what we can do. So I hope that in terms of ranking and speed of response, I have responded to you, my brother.
Maybe the other question is on if we are hopeful in our engagement with the government. First and foremost, I would like to say we operate even in an environment where there is no hope. For as long as there are human rights abuses, we operate, and we even tackle very difficult human rights questions. I think you may know that for 40 years now, we have been tackling a very difficult human rights question, which is the death penalty. And there was no hope. But we saw changes that have taken place globally. What we are going to do is to actually engage with the government in Zimbabwe so that we urge them to renounce the abuses of the past and actually so that the new transition project the opportunities that is there to commit to human rights and the rule of law.
So I'm going to take the last round because we're running out of time.
Couple of countries in Southern Africa. In fact, first across 28 countries across Southern Africa, more than half of the continent, media freedom was curtailed and journalists faced criminalization. And I will ask you to look at our report country by country so that you can actually look at the context of the various cases that we have reported, including in Southern Africa. What I was saying in Southern Africa is that every country is trying to limit the space for freedom of expression, either by creating licensing regime. In Angola, for example, they created that PEC, media law PEC, that was designed to regulate media, including creating a regulatory and oversight body so that journalists can go and register, media organizations can go and register. We know that here in Zimbabwe they have done that as well in 2001 with the Broadcasting Services Act, which is supposed to produce licensing regimes for community radio stations, but nothing has happened. So in Angola they did the same. In Zambia they're doing the same. In South Africa they're also doing the same. Cyber security is the new site of the new frontier of violations. In Zimbabwe, I think they even appointed, when they got really excited with this new a minister for cyber security, who was short-lived and reincarnated as Minister of Finance later on. And in Lesotho, so there are many countries, and I just urge you that, in this report, if you want a specific detail of which law, when, and who was affected by it, we have documented that. But we're saying that approach of an attack on the online space limits freedom of expression, and that is a sacrosanct right as far as we are concerned, because it undermines everything post-colonial states stand for. They stood for this against colonialism. They must now open the space.
Yeah, so
for these and other stories, visit our website www.263chat.com. Follow us on Twitter @263chat and like our Facebook page 263chat.